a big one. In 2016, both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama said it was impossible to hack American elections. Today, though, Hillary Clinton accused President Trump of, quote, surrender to Russia, with whom she apparently thinks we're at war, by not doing more to stop Russian interference. Philippe Reines is a longtime Russia hunter, an enemy of the Kremlin, also a former Hillary Clinton advisor. He worked with her at State and other places. He joins us tonight. So, Philippe, how is Trump, like, what exactly specifically should Trump be doing against the Russians right now?
Well, let me try it this way. Let's forget about 2016. Let's assume that he won 50 states, 535-0. She came out of her voting booth and said, you know what, he's so great, I voted for him. Nothing happened in 2016. Let's assume for a moment that Donald Trump's CIA director, his director of national intelligence, and his director of the NSA testified before Congress and told him, presumably, that North Korea was attempting and planning on disrupting our elections in 2018 as a precursor to 2020. And they were doing so with the intent of disrupting the incumbents, and they might hurt House members who are incumbents. What conversation we would be having then?
I guess I would. Here's, like, I've been here most of my life. I don't really care what a lot of people in Washington State, because they're dishonest and stupid.
Well, for a moment, let's stipulate.
You know, you really telling me that Russia, which has a contracting economy and population and position on the world stage, a single military base outside its own borders, is a graver threat to the United States than China, or even in the same
Well, first off, I don't think it's whack-a-mole. They could both be significant adversaries.
We're not talking at all. We're sucking up to China. Our business sector, our entertainment sector, our political sector, all kowtow toward China. We're not.
I'm not defending China.
No, but I'm just saying, like, what we're hearing from the Democratic left is that the existential threat to the country is from Russia, and the facts don't show that. It's insane, actually.
The intelligence show, and it's intelligence presented by Donald Trump's appointees, Republican appointees, that they are going to interfere with our 2018 election.
How exactly are they going to do that?
They've done it a number of ways. First of all, we've now learned that they got into the registration rolls of 7 states prior to election day.
So how do you imagine? I mean, look,
how did they get into Sony? I mean, the North Koreans got into Sony.
But I mean, it's like a serious question.
I mean, you and I can't talk about how someone does or doesn't hack anything.
Hold on. Democrats have pushed
after talking about 2 people who got into the DNC.
Look, I'm against foreign hacking. China is the primary offender.
So what should we be doing about it?
We never mentioned that. Democrats have pushed for years online voting because they think it will increase their share of the turnout, because it makes it easy and their voters don't like to get out of bed and go to the polls. So how can they still...
I'm nodding, but I don't agree with you.
Okay, but how can they still be pushing for online voting if we face this hacking threat from foreign countries? Why wouldn't we just use paper ballots?
I don't think this is as simple as online voting. Who in the United States...
That's not more vulnerable than paper ballots?
Who in the United States is in charge of protecting us against China interfering with our elections? Even if it's hard, even if it's going to fail, who's in charge?
Well, presumably you would think our captains of industry, of entertainment, Silicon Valley, our military, our State Department.
Who's in charge of fighting opioids?
I don't know. I mean,
Kellyanne Conway.
Okay.
Look. Why wouldn't there be a White House coordinator?
But what would he do? I guess that's what I'm saying.
Or she.
Okay, well, I'm actually using the broadly accepted pronoun that can stand for either one.
But let's just say it was Mike Pence for a moment.
Right.
What he would do is he would do a number of things. First of all, he would take a whole-of-government approach. But specifically, you hit a good point, which is that this also involves the private sector. This involves Facebook. This involves Google. He could bring people together and they could share best practices.
The first thing you would do is you would say no electronic voting, because it's vulnerable to foreign hacking. Yet Democrats are pushing electronic. Yes, you would. Of course, any system.
I have a better source than you. I wouldn't.
No, I have better sources, and also I have common sense, which trumps all, which tells you that any system in which electronic data transfers between 2 points is vulnerable to hacking.
Yeah, but all voter rolls are electronic already.
Okay, but voting itself in states with paper ballots is safer than those that have electronic voting. Yet Democrats are pushing for electronic voting, even though they claim Russia's going to hack the election. How can that be?
I think we were talking about
we're talking about the same thing. No, we're talking about the same thing.
Oranges.
Our democratic vulnerabilities.
That argues for the next 100 years to use paper as opposed to making sure our voting systems are.
Oh, because I gave you a specific thing that we can do to harden our democracy, and you laugh because it might hurt Democrats.
I didn't laugh. You said it's the first thing I wanted to do.
It's the obvious thing, but no one wants to do it.
But let's set aside hacking. Let's just use the word screwing around or interfering.
20 seconds. Hit me with it.
If it's interfering.
Yeah.
Let's just say they can't do it. Let's just say they're bad at it. Let's forget about 2016. I know you got the people over here in the Nothing Burger camp, and you got the people over here in the Double Whopper with cheese camp. What should we be doing that we're not? And it seems that the people in charge of protecting us do not think we're doing enough.
Okay, well then I think every Democrat in Congress should do, and every Republican, to suspend all electronic voting until we can be sure the Russians can't hack it. That way we can have total confidence in the integrity.
Why do we
of our
bank?
elections. No, I don't know.
Why don't we just go back to the fax machines and carrier
we're
pigeons?
not so worried about Russia all of a sudden. I love this. This is so
I'm
great.
the one worried. You're the one
talking to people. All right.
You do the Russia, the China ball over here.
Philippe, great to see you.
Always fun.
Well, the Senate held a public hearing today about alleged Russian hacking, in the 2016 election. During the hearing, Senator Marco Rubio said he's been targeted by Russian hackers as recently as yesterday.
In July of 2016, shortly after I announced that I would seek re-election to the United States Senate, former members of my presidential campaign team who had access to the internal information of my presidential campaign were targeted by IP addresses with an unknown location within Russia. That effort was unsuccessful. I'd also informed the committee that within the last 24 hours, at 10:45 a.m. yesterday, a second attempt was made, again, against former members of my presidential campaign team who had access to our internal information, again targeted from an IP address from an unknown location in Russia, and that effort was also unsuccessful.
Well, meanwhile, Carter Page, who is often identified as a Trump advisor, but whom the Trump people deny ever really was, denied collaborating with the Russians in any way during an interview with our own Catherine Herridge. Here's part of it.
The stuff about me is just literally completely false in every way, shape, and form.
Do you know this former British intelligence officer, Christopher Steele?
I've never met him.
Well, that's not the only Russian news today. The Wall Street Journal tonight reports that former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who appears to have gone completely off the deep end, has offered to testify about Russia in return for immunity from prosecution. What to make of all of this? Well, Stephen Cohen is a contributing editor at The Nation magazine. He's also professor emeritus of Russian studies at Princeton and NYU, one of the eminent Russia scholars in the world. And unlike most people talking about this, actually speaks fluent Russian. Professor Cohen joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on. So let me just say that there are a lot of strands to this story, a lot of things I don't understand. It seems pretty clear that General Flynn behaved in ways that are very hard to defend. But at the core of this story is the allegation that the Russian government hacked our election, is the phrase people are using, broke into email accounts at the DNC and over in the campaign office and used those to help Trump win. Everyone assumes this is true. We're all operating on the assumption that it's true. Do we know it's true?
No. And if you listen to the hearings at the Senate today, repeatedly it was said, particularly by Senator Warner, the Democratic co-chair of the proceedings, that Russia had hijacked our democracy.
Right.
And what he means is that the Russians, at Putin's direction, had gone into the Democratic National Committee's emails, which were embarrassing to Mrs. Clinton, given them to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks then released them to damage Mrs. Clinton and put Trump in the White House. This is a very dramatic narrative. And they're saying in Washington that this was an act of war. Let me repeat, Tucker. They are saying this was an act of war. So whether or not it's true is existential. Are we at war? Right. I got interested in this, not because it's my expertise, but because one of the things I've studied for 40 years is Russian leadership. I've written biographies. I got interested in Putin. I'm writing about Putin, a long piece now. So I looked into it to see if it made sense that Putin could have or did do such a thing. And I can find not one piece of factual evidence. The only evidence ever presented was a study hired by the Clintons, the DNC, to do an examination of their computers. They concluded the Russians did it. Their report has fallen apart. The question is why the FBI decided to use that private kind of private detective, let's say, as though the New York police department had decided for a murderer to hire a private detective. Why the FBI didn't do their own investigation. And that's all we have.
That's all we have, and yet night after night, I get people on both sides, Republicans as well, saying 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, by the way, that would include Coast Guard intelligence, I guess they're on this too, have concluded that the Russian government was behind this. Have they not concluded that?
They say that, but it's bogus. When Clapper, the head of whatever it's called, Director of National Intelligence, signed that report in January, Technically, he represents all 17. I'll bet you a dime to a nickel you couldn't get a guest on, unprepared, who could name 10 of them. This figure 17 is bogus. But the point here is critical. The one agency that could conceivably have done a forensic examination on the Democratic computers is the National Security Agency. We learned from Snowden, they're in your computer, mine, our e-phones.
Yes.
Everybody else who signed that report said they were highly confident. The NSA said it was only moderately confident. You don't get married based on moderate confidence. You don't go to war with Russia. You don't stage this theater that's going on in Washington which could destroy a presidency. But there's one other thing, and let me leave you with this. When they admit they have no evidence, they fall back on something else, which I think is very important. They say Putin directed Russian propaganda at us and helped elect Trump. I don't know about you, Tucker, but I find that insulting, because the premise they're putting out in Washington in this hearing is that the American people are zombies or lambs that'll fight, I'm mixing my metaphors, any Judas goat, anywhere Putin leads them. It's the premise of democracy that we're democratic citizens, that we have a BS detector in us and we know how to use it. But they're telling us at Washington, I mean, like what Rubio's telling us. I mean, every politician who loses election here in America and in Europe is going to say it was hacked by Putin, and that's wrong.
That's right.
And that's what Mrs. Clinton is saying.
And they've also never demonstrated, by the way, why Putin exactly would want Trump to win, because Trump's for fracking? I mean, it doesn't, anyway. Professor, thank you for that. And I think it's worth, I don't know the truth, but I do think it's worth asking these questions, and I appreciate your doing that. Thanks.